I absolutely love tube amps, but there's no denying that tube amp manufacturers are facing some ferocious competition in the marketplace from products that can sound just as good and are a lot easier to acquire. So I get it that they have to innovate to create products that will keep the modern guitar player interested. But that being said, there's a little trend that amp manufacturers are following that it's concerning me a little bit, and I want to chat about that today. Hey there, I'm Dan, the self-proclaimed lonely rocker. Thank you so much for joining me today. So yeah, I had this little thing I want to get off my chest. Would love to get into a discussion with you guys. If you have any thoughts at all, that's what the comment section is for. But right up front, it's really important to note, I'm not here to criticize anyone, to judge any manufacturer. It's a very competitive marketplace out there, especially for tube amp manufacturers. There's been a lot of challenges. We went through some supply chain concerns, which actually affected everyone. But for tube amp manufacturers, it's become really challenging because digital alternatives have just gotten so good and they're even more accessible in terms of cost. When I first started playing guitar in the 80s, we had the tube amp versus the solid state amp wars. And a lot of metal guys like the solid state amps, so like Dimebag Darrell swore by them. But ultimately, the tube amps, I believe, won that war. But today, it's a completely different thing. Now, when I got started, my first guitar, which is still sitting right here, or my first electric guitar, spent about $200 on a USA-made Gibson guitar, a little sort of lesser-known model here. And my first amplifier, which didn't show up probably till several months later, was that little Yamaha combo amp there, which happens to be a solid-state amplifier. Sounded terrible, but then I'd add pedals and I absolutely loved it. Now, I didn't have as many choices then as young players have today. That's what we had. And after playing for a while and I started to get a little more serious, then I invested in a tube amplifier, this Marshall JCM 900. And slowly I started adding more gear as I got more and more into this. But if you're a young player today, chances are you're going to pick up something like this. And we were talking the $200 I spent on that little solid state amplifier. Today, you can get something like this. It's got 63 amps, you've got cabinets, you've got effects. It's a good little unit for not a lot of money. I mean, my rig is going to be very uninspiring to a young guitar player. So now, if you start on this, where do you go from here? Well, likely you're going to be looking at Helix products. We've got Headrush, Quad Cortex, we've got Fractal here. Perhaps you want to graduate to a more professional modeler. And also, pro players who typically use tube amps are now touring with the digital alternatives. I mean, Kirk Hammett from Metallica talks about using Axe Effects. I recently saw Big Rec. He's known for using some amazing amplifiers, but live he was using an FM9. But today, a lot of the guitar heroes are using the digital technology, and the young players are going to be influenced by their heroes. So where do amp manufacturers stand in that equation? It becomes challenging because today you want a Fractal, you want a Helix, and that's just a reality for amp manufacturing today. So what got me thinking about all of this was this image. That's the Diesel VHX. Now, it's actually been on the marketplace for a little while, but it sort of struck a chord with me, no pun intended, when I saw this image, because it sort of reminded me of a trend that we're seeing in amp manufacturing. Now, the challenges are real for amp manufacturers. They're competing with convenience. The differences now are not so much how they sound. The difference is the experience. Because really, when it comes down to it, if a listener is listening, they don't care what created that sound as long as the sound is good. And if you can take the best Marshall amp model or use a real Marshall amplifier, record it into a track, mix it, the listener is not going to know the difference. So what is the difference? The difference is the experience for the guitar player, right? Ultimately, that's going to sell that guitar player whether they want to use a model or whether they want to use a real amp. And today you'll see amps in studios, you'll still see them in gigs, but more and more guitar players are traveling with this. But that image that I just talked about, the VHX, that trend has been happening with amps now for a couple of years where they're getting smaller. They're integrating digital components inside of an analog amplifier, all in the spirit of creating conveniences for the guitar player and giving them more choices and more options like they get in the amp modelers. This is where I have a bit of concern because a good amplifier, a good tube amplifier should last forever. Now, I've had this Marshall here for 25 plus years. I've had it in the shop numerous times. I've taken this to any number of repair shops and pretty much all of the components in this amp are readily available. You don't have to be a Marshall technician to fix that amplifier. That's pretty much the same with most tube amplifiers. There may be an exception out there, but by and large, most of the amplifiers are using available circuitry and technology, just parts that you can buy from different suppliers. Amp modelers are different. A couple of things. Number one, we're sort of in this digital culture that it's the latest and greatest. So, okay, the Helix has been around for 9 years, but Fractal certainly is not shy to put out new versions of their products. I just got the FM9 a couple of months ago, and now I hear there's a new one coming out a couple of months later. It's just the reality of the digital world. But the products are more accessible, but they're able to update their products and just build on that and introduce more and more products. That's something amp manufacturers can't do. They're trying to innovate to keep with this trend that's happening in the digital world. I mean, guitar players have been conditioned that they need to have something that's portable, that's smaller, that's more flexible. So amp manufacturers have innovated and are adding components to their amps to sort of emulate what modelers are doing. I still think tube amps are better, but they're not nearly as flexible as their digital counterpart. So tube amps are now being influenced by the products that were influenced by the tube amps. Think about that for a second. But as I said, tube amps, if you take care of them, should last forever as long as those tubes still exist. Pretty much all the components in here are readily available. If your modeler goes down, you're at the mercy of the manufacturer of that modeler. So if you have a problem with your Fractal, likely you have to send it to the distributor you bought it from or directly to Fractal, and they'll evaluate whether or not they can fix it. But the components inside of these devices, they're not as readily available. Your local repair shop can't fix them. So that's something you have to consider when you buy a digital product. There is going to be an end of life for a digital product. So by inserting this digital technology, whether it be DI capability, because that's something actually it's common with a couple of my amps here. The Rev G20 has a DI load box built into it. There's an analog and digital component to that. The Grandmeister over here, for example, there's digital effects built into that. The dials on the amp are not the typical dials you see on an amplifier. They're actually potentiometers because they transmit digital information to the digital effects inside the device. You can also save presets. Now, if an amp manufacturer decides that's what they need to do to create a product that's more viable in this marketplace, what happens if that experiment doesn't work? Let's say they abandon that platform. Now, the Grandmeister Deluxe 40 has been a very successful amplifier for Hughes and Kettner, and it's been on the market for a number of years. But let's say they decide to discontinue that amp. What happens to the parts that drives that part of the amplifier? They're not going to be readily available. Once Hughes and Kettner runs out of those parts, that's pretty much the end of life for that part of the amplifier. I don't have to worry about that with this Marshall. Now, if we run out of tubes, well, then we're in a whole different world in terms of amplifiers. But I know that this amp likely should last me for my lifetime and beyond, unless something terrible happens to it. Any of these amplifiers that have digital components inside, I think it's a bit risky. And if you're looking at really expensive amplifiers, and it was that diesel amp that really got me thinking about it, because diesel amps are very expensive. What happens if they abandon that platform? You know, you've got that screen, you've got the components inside that drive those effects. That was custom made for that particular amplifier. If diesel abandons that platform, and you went out and spent, I don't know what that amp's worth, $4,000 or $5,000, what happens 5-10 years from now? You might have a really expensive amplifier that just can't be repaired. It's thrilling to have all the effects, to have all of the choices, but amplifiers have always been an investment. A lot of people who buy amplifiers will say, well, the resale won't be a problem, I'll be able to sell it. This Marshall amplifier is worth more than I paid for it. If I was to sell it on today's market, and the 900s are not that expensive, but the going rate for a JCM 900 in today's dollars is more than I paid for it 20 years or so ago when I bought it. So it's a secure investment. There's going to be some value. Digital products are a depreciating asset. If you bought an Axe 8 and you're trying to sell it today, you'll be lucky if you're going to get 50% of the value that you paid for that Axe 8 originally. The Helix has been out for 9 years now, which is a long time in the digital world, but there's going to be an end of life for the Helix at some point. Technology is going to dictate that they're going to have to move on. And then suddenly, if you own a Helix, well, the value of this product is going to go down substantially. Amplifiers to me have always been that alternative that if you can afford an amp, eventually get a real good tube amp, that's something that you should be able to enjoy for most of your life. You can pass it on to your kids, you can sell it, it will still have value. But suddenly we have all of these really great tube amplifiers that have this digital circuitry inside. What do these amps look like 10, 15, 20 years from now if companies have abandoned that part of the amplifier? I get it on some level that reality exists. I mean, talking about tubes, all the tubes that used to be manufactured don't exist anymore. There's certain tubes that drove certain devices that you just can't get anymore. But as far as guitar amps are concerned, the 12AX7s, the 6L6s, the EL34s, and all the ones that are similar to that, there's a pretty healthy supply of those tubes because it is a smaller industry now. So the manufacturers are pretty much making the tubes that us guitar players are consuming. So I think it's something to think about. And remember that consumers drive the marketplace, right? Manufacturers are creating products and then they're designing marketing around those products to convince you that that's the product that you need to get. And I really don't like how sort of the digital age has conditioned us to believe that we always have to have the newest iPhone operating systems on computers. That's a big one. If you're investing in plugins, trust me, plugins are not an investment because when you update your operating system, those software companies have to move their software forward. And if you're going to stay on an older version, eventually you're going to be left behind. And that thing that you paid good money for suddenly is not going to have any value. That's just a reality. Operating systems, plug-in versions, modelers going on to new versions. There's end of life for all of these devices. I'd really hate to see that happen to something as valuable as a tube amp, simply because a manufacturer decided they had to put a digital component inside of that amplifier. And you go and spend $4,000 or $5,000 on a beautiful tube amplifier, and suddenly there's a part of that amp that doesn't work anymore. Anyways, I don't want to labor this point. I certainly would love to hear what you think about this. Does this trend in amp manufacturing concern you? Let me know in the comments. Would love to hear from you. But if you did enjoy this video, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that bell. And remember, you don't need a band to rock and roll. I'll catch you in the next one.